Okay, let's get started. My name's John Minford, and this is the third or fourth time I've come to Hang Seng to give talks, so I don't really need to introduce myself. Every year I get a year older, that's the only difference. And I've been translating Chinese literature since I was a student in 1966, so that's 50-something years. So that it says something for the longevity of Chinese literature. I'm going to give 4 talks this month, and I'm starting today. But before I start, I just want to say my usual words of thanks to Hang Seng. Now it's a university, which is wonderful. And thank you, Shelby, thank you, Gilbert, thank you, William, all my friends here, and Esther, and the whole team in the office. You know, it always feels so nice to come back here. And if I'm a little bit breathless today, it's because I only got in at midnight last night. I flew from New Zealand via Australia, and I'm a little bit jet lagged, so I won't go too close to the edge in case I fall off. But I chose this time to talk about poetry because I always talk about Hong Lao Meng, and I get a bit bored by Hong Lao Meng. You know, it's a terrible confession, but I can't go on talking about Hong Lao Meng for the rest of my life, you know. So I thought I would, and you know, in my career I started off with Hong Lao Meng, and then I did things like Liao Zhai, and then I worked on early Chinese thought, you know, with the Sun Zi Bingfa and the I Ching, and just recently I finished the Dao De Jing. But now I think it's my prerogative to explore Chinese poetry. I feel I'm sufficiently old and sufficiently, you know, I've gone through a few other things. Now I want to enjoy poetry, because for me, reading poetry is pure pleasure. You can never call it work. It's whether it's English poetry or French poetry or Chinese poetry. For me, it's one of the greatest pleasures in my life, second only to music. So I chose to give 4 lectures this time on translating Chinese poetry. And each of the 4 lectures has a different theme. And I'm going to begin by just briefly describing the whole sort of series of lectures and what I'm doing. We've just been listening, by the way, to some music which was written by the Jesuit priests in Beijing in the 18th century. And I'm going to be talking later on about the Jesuits. So I thought I'd play a little bit of that music while we're sort of getting ready. Now, today's lecture is called Songs on a Very Slow Boat, and it's how the Shi Jing came to be translated, basically. And the kind of motto or symbol of these talks is the Chinese character Ling, and it's a word that's an incredible, powerful word. I have a very large stone outside my library in New Zealand carved with that character by a friend of mine who's a stone carver, and it gives me inspiration every time I go into my library. My library is out in my garden, you see, and I have to walk across the garden to get there, and there's this huge stone saying Ling. And it's funny because the word Ling was used by Hugh Kenner, who's a great Ezra Pound scholar, and he said that, you know, Ling, with its dancers below and its rain falling from above. So that he's analyzing the character, because the character Ling has got these 2 shamanistic dances at the bottom, the Wu, and then it has the radical for rain, Yu, at the top, and then it's got these 3, what I think of them as being 3 mouths, you know, in the middle. And it's a great symbol for inspiration. In the old days, it was the inspiration of the shamans. The shamans, you know, who called down the spirits from above. And the spirits from above literally inspired them. That's breathed into them, you see, inspiration. Inspiration is when something breathes into you, and that's the essence of poetry, is inspiration. And I suppose, you know, the general idea of my talks is that inspiration is the key to poetry. It's also the key to translating poetry. And I'm not going to read all of that because we'll just get bored. But the whole 4 lectures is around the word Ling. And today's lecture is going to be about how the Chinese book of songs, the Shi Jing, very slowly over several centuries came to be translated out of Chinese. And I'm going to be talking about that in some detail today. And there's a great deal of stuff on your handout, so I'll try and cover it all, but I may not be able to. And then the second lecture, which is next Saturday, is about translating mostly Tang poetry, and how the translation of the great classics of Chinese poetry, you know, Li Bo, Du Fu, and so on and so forth, how that emerged out of the 19th century, and how it then became, it was sort of captured by the modernists. And I've got a particular point of view on that, which I will be talking about next Saturday. It's all in your handout. And then the third lecture, which is the Saturday after that, the 23rd, I'm going to be talking about the most difficult of all Chinese styles of poetry to translate, in my opinion, and that's, of course, the Ci, the Song Ci, or whether you call it Song Ci or Qing Ci, or even recent Ci. It's incredibly difficult to translate because there's so little actual content, you know. It's like, and I call it, spirit ditties of no tone, which is a quotation from the great poet John Keats in his famous poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. And he talks about heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Now, with Ci poetry, you know, we all know they were written to melodies, but we don't know, the melodies have now disappeared to a large extent, so they're unheard. So we're trying to create songs, but there is no music. They are, in fact, silent. They are songs without words. They're songs without music. And that was what Stephen Sung called his book. And then the last lecture on the 30th is going to be about translating 20th century Chinese poetry. I'll be talking about, all my lectures are going to be about case studies, you know. Anyone who knows me knows that I have no theory at all. I don't believe in theory when it comes to translation. And I'm always being put up against theoreticians. You know, I'm always stood up as the kind of enemy of theory. I recall a PhD exam, which I was attending in Hong Kong as one of the examiners. And there was quite a well-known theoretician on the examining board. And at the end of the young lady's presentation, it's a very, very good thesis. I won't say what it was about because I'll give it away, but this gentleman leant forward and he said to the lady, "Excuse me, miss," whatever her name was, "I don't see any sign of theory in your thesis." And the poor lady was shaking like a leaf because she thought, "My God, I'm going to fail." So I thought that was the moment when I had to come to her rescue. So I turned to this gentleman, whose name I will not mention, and I said to him, "Professor XYZ, you don't seem to understand that the ultimate theory is no theory." And he looked at me, like I was some kind of Zen master, you know. And I have to say that was one of the moments in my academic career of which I am particularly proud, because I do believe actually that no theory is the best theory, and anyone who knows me realizes that that is a very deeply held belief. So I will not be giving you any theory at all. And if you detect any theory in my lectures, please put your hand up, and I'll give you $100, Hong Kong dollars, okay? Because I really don't, I always try and guide my students away from theory, as all my students know. So that's the last one. It's about modern poetry. It's rather different because modern Chinese poetry is so influenced by the West that it has problems of its own anyway. And that's where I'm going to end. So today we're on the Shi Jing. I've called it Songs on a Very Slow Boat because it took a long, long time for the Shi Jing to be translated, and it still hasn't been done very well. So we're still traveling on a slow boat. And as you know, there's a very famous song called I Want to Get You on a Slow Boat to China. It's a kind of love song, really. I want to get you on a slow boat to China, you know, and make love to you on that boat. And I hope it takes a very long time to get there, you know. And that's why I've called it Songs on a Very Slow Boat. Now, I want to begin by, and this is not theory, this is history, okay? I don't mind history because it's a kind of story, you know. And I want to make a comparison between translating the Shi Jing and translating the Bible. And the point of this comparison is to show you that with these great big books like the Bible or the Shi Jing or the I Ching or whatever, translation is actually a gradual process. It's a kind of accretion, It's things evolve out of each other. And if you look at the Bible, does this thing have a little red dot? How do I get it to work? Anyway, if you look at the Bible, we all talk about the King James Bible being one of the great moments in the whole history of translation. But the King James Bible depended very heavily on all of these Bibles that came before, starting with the Latin Bible of St. Jerome, and then, actually starting with the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, way back in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. They translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And then St. Jerome, the patron saint of translators, translated the whole Bible into Latin, the so-called Vulgate. And then you have Wycliffe, you have Tyndale, and so on. And then finally you get to the King James Version, which, as you all know, was done by a committee and contains large amounts of translation from the previous Bibles. It wasn't suddenly done out of nothing. It was a gradual process. And you see, with the Shi Jing, it's very similar. My story is going to be like this. The very first translations of the Shi Jing that I'm aware of were into the Manchu language. They were done by the Manchu conquerors, who invested a huge amount of time and effort and money into the project of translating all the Chinese classics into Manchu. So there was a translation of the Shi Jing into Manchu in the 17th century. And then there was a Latin version in the 18th century done by Jesuits, or by one Jesuit, Father Alexandre de la Charme, and he based his translation largely on the Manchu translation. So it's a process whereby people take what's come before and add to it. And then after that, in the 19th century, we have James Legge, the great James Legge, who I talked about some 2 or 3 years ago. And he was very indebted to the Latin version of La Charme. And then there was Arthur Waley and so on, ending up with the crazy Ezra Pound, the sort of so-called modernist, He was just an insane character. But he based his translation very largely on Legge and the Latin version. So it's not with these great big books, it's usually a gradual process, You build on what's come before. And that's the sort of a general point I want to make. And the comparison with the Bible, I think, is a very telling one. I think I should ask, am I being heard clearly? Is that okay? I don't like having this thing on my thing, but I suppose I ought to, yeah. So, I want to begin, and it's not the first time I've done this, I often do this. I want to begin by reading a poem with you by the great John Keats. And the point of this is that it's a poem about translation. It's a poem about how a translation of a poem can make you feel like you're seeing a new world, that you're seeing a new planet in the skies, or you're discovering a new ocean. That's what great translation of poetry is all about. It helps you to see a new world, and it's very difficult. And this is the famous. This is John Keats, you see, swooning away. Poor man. He died so young. You may have seen, that famous film that was made recently about John Keats. Very good film, actually. And this is the great poem, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. I had to learn this by heart when I was a schoolboy, and I thought Chapman was just a friend of his, and he borrowed a copy of Homer from Chapman. And my teacher never told me that Chapman was actually the translator. So I didn't understand this poem at all, but I had to learn it by heart. And it goes like this: much have I traveled in the realms of gold. That means literature. I've read a lot of books. And many goodly states and kingdoms seen. I've visited, great worlds of poetry and literature. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, until I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. He wrote that poem having walked home across London with a copy of the translation by Chapman of Homer lent to him by a friend. And he was so carried away by the translation that he just sat down and read that poem in one go. He didn't have to revise it, he didn't have to plan it, it was pure inspiration. And we have the manuscript of it. There it is, that's the actual manuscript of Keats's sonnet. He just wrote it straight off and gave it to a man and said, please take this to my friend. He was a man of extraordinary inspiration, Keats. A pure poet, perhaps the purest poet that ever lived in the English language. And this is Mr. Chapman, the translator, the man whose translation of Homer is still read today. I have a copy of it. It's written in it's called iambic hexameters at 6 feet. Titum, 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 which is a very heavy kind of meter, but it's very effective. And he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, but he is famous for his translation of both Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And that's the front page of his translation of Homer. Homer, the prince of poets. And you see, it's thanks to translations like that that in the Western tradition we're able to pass on, the very origins of poetic art in Europe, like Homer, Virgil, and all the great poets of Greece and Rome. They've been handed down through translation, especially today when nobody bothers to learn Latin and Greek. Now, in his poem, he talks about how reading the translation made him feel like two things. One was a watcher of the skies, or an astronomer who discovers a new planet. Can you imagine the excitement of discovering a new planet? My goodness, what's that? And it was actually Uranus. And this is this man, Herschel, who had a big telescope, and he discovered a new planet. And it was just a few years before Keats wrote that poem. And the other thing was the Spanish explorers who went to Central America, and they crossed the isthmus, the Panama Isthmus, and they got to a certain height, and suddenly they saw on the other side another ocean, They'd already crossed one ocean. They knew about that, but they didn't realize there was another one on the other side, the Pacific. We all know about the Pacific today, but 300 years ago people didn't know. And they suddenly thought, my God, there's a whole world out there that we didn't know about. And what Keats is saying is that a good translation like Chapman enables you to see a new world, a new planet. And it's therefore of incredible importance. And I'm going to be applying that to the idea of translating the Shi Jing. And to give the game away, this is a kind of spoiler. There isn't a good translation of the Shi Jing. So we can't say to a friend, here's the Shi Jing in English, and expect them to discover a new planet, because they won't. We're waiting still for a great translation of the Shi Jing. Maybe one of you here today will do it, Who knows? It certainly won't be me, I tell you. I'm retired now. So here we are. We come to the main subject, which is the Shi Jing, right? The Chinese, I'm going to call it the Book of Songs. Sometimes it's called the Book of Odes, or sometimes it's called the Book of Poetry. But I think at least 80% of the poems in the Shi Jing were songs. Now I think I ought to get my copy of the handout, because otherwise I'm just going to wander. I try to make my PowerPoint synchronize with the handout, but I'm not always very successful. I tried very hard today, but I was rather jet-lagged. At one point my PowerPoint crashed completely, and I thought I was going to be having to take the next plane back to New Zealand. What have I done there? I turned the whole thing off, right, okay. So here's an old edition of the Shi Jing, just to give you a feel of the reality of this book. It is one of the 13 classics, one of the great classics of Chinese civilization, It's not just poems, it's a classic, it's a jing. And it's been handed down ever since the Han Dynasty, you know, and commented on by numerous people, most famously of all by the Sung philosopher Zhu Xi, of course. His commentary was compulsory reading. So it's not just poetry, it's poetry that became a classic, that became something everybody had to know. Everybody had to know the Shi Jing by heart, you know. And this is a very beautiful, illustrated, hand-copied Shi Jing from the reign of Qianlong. And very early on, it was written about in Europe. I mean, not translated so much as written about. And this comment here is actually on your handout on page 2. And it's basically, I'm not going to read this all, but it's just saying, it's basically a very free translation from the Lunyu, where Kongzi, where Confucius talks about how important the Shi Jing is, you know. You can't really be a man unless, or a woman indeed, without knowing the Shi Jing. You can't have a conversation, you know. You can't cope. You've got to learn the Shi Jing for about 5 or 6 different reasons. And it was terribly important. And one of those reasons was not that it's a beautiful book of poetry. That's irrelevant, you know. It wasn't being promoted by the Confucians as a work of art. It was being promoted as a classic, something that teaches you how to live and how to behave and how to speak. That's very important, because it fell into the hands of the commentators very early on. I mean, right from the days of Confucius. You see? Okay. Can you tell me how to work the little red light? Do you know? Anybody know? William, do you know? No. Do you know? Oh, you look as if you know. Anyway, you're looking very keen. Now, I think there's a little red light there. Is that it? That one there, okay. And it'll shine up there, will it? Oh, there it is, yes. Okay, you see, for example, at the bottom here it says, the odes teach us how at home we may serve our parent, and how abroad, outside of our home, we can serve our prince. So the Shi Jing, right from the start, Confucius regarded it as a guide to how to live, you see. Whereas, of course, nowadays we look at it as a collection of early songs and hymns. Now, as I said earlier on, the very first translation of the Shi Jing was in fact done by the Manchus. And not many people know this, but when the Manchus conquered China, they took it very seriously, actually, not just as armed force, but they had to understand how the Chinese civilization functioned. And one of the things they did was to put a huge amount of money into translation. They created a translation bureau. And I think that's coming up next. But here are the so-called Bachi, the 8 banners of the Manchus, you know. They were a very well-organized group of people. And they completely conquered China. I mean, they had to really kill a lot of Chinese in order to succeed. They massacred huge numbers of Chinese people, especially in Shandong. Now, they set up, inside this thing called the Jinjichu, they set up a thing called the Nei Fan Shu Fang. And it's clear on here that what has been called in English the Sino-Manchu Translation Office. You know, I mean, I think as a large translation school in this university, it's quite interesting to look back at history and to realize that in the 17th century, the Manchus took translation not just seriously, but they actually created institutions, you know. They had a large translation school, and it was mainly concerned with translating Chinese stuff into Manchu. And it's important because the later translators, who are mostly Jesuit priests, they used the Manchu. They often didn't even look at the Chinese. They read the Manchu because Manchu is much easier to learn than Chinese. Those Jesuits reckoned that you could learn Manchu in about 1 year. You know, it's a phonetic script. It's not like Chinese. And those Manchu translations had already done the work. You know, they'd already interpreted the songs. So a lot of the early translations were taken straight from Manchu. And there are very few people now who study Manchu, unfortunately. So here you see is a bilingual Sino-Manchu, you see, Manhan, Shu Jing, the classic of history, you see, the Shu Jing was already being translated in the third year of Qianlong. You see, Qianlong Sanyan, it was printed. So in the first half of the 18th century that was printed. And this is another Sino-Manchu text, you see. And they call it Hebi. Hebi, and later on I'll show you a picture of a jade, which is Hebi. It's when two parts match each other. It was the old-fashioned word for bilingual. So this is a bilingual version of a book, of a musical text, the Qinpu. And here's the Sanzijing, the three-character classic, was also translated in a Hebi bilingual edition, which is both Manchu and Chinese, you see. Actually, I think this one is Manchu and Mongolian, I think, actually. That's interesting, yeah. So you've got, I think that's probably, I'm not an expert on that. I think that's probably, oh dear, sorry. I think that's probably Manchu and that's Mongolian, because there were a lot of Mongolians in the banners. So this is the earliest stage of translating the Shijing out of Chinese. The earliest I know of, anyway. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Japanese translations, but they would have been a lot later, I think. This is an interesting example of how the word Hebi is used in painting. When two painters paint together, it's called Hebi Shanshui. This is a Hebi Shanshui by two very famous painters, Shen Zhou and Wen Zhengming, and they did it together. And in fact, I'm going to be using this word Hebi as a kind of second theme of my talk, along with Ling. Hebi is when two things match. And if you want to say that the translation's really good, you can use the term Hebi, and we'll come to that later. So here, and the Manchus didn't just do classics, you see. They obviously needed to understand how Chinese sex life worked, because they translated the whole of Jinping Mei into Manchu. They also translated Hong Lo Meng and Liao Zhai. They were very busy, you know, and extremely cultivated people. Some of these Manchus, some of these Qiren were just amazing people. I've always been very fascinated by them. You know, the greatest poet of the Qing dynasty, Nalan Xingde, he was a Manchu, you know. And of course, Cao Sui-Chen was almost a Manchu himself. He belonged to a very Manchu type of Chinese family. I don't think the women in Hong Lo Meng have bound feet, for example. There's no sign of the women having bound feet. I think they were Manchus. They were living in a Manchu-style household. The people in mainland would kill me for saying that, but I think Hong Lo Meng is basically a Manchu novel. You know, it breeds the culture of the Qiren. Anyway, that's a bit of a red herring. Sorry. So having got the Shijing into Manchu, that's the first step, if you like. But it's an important step because Manchu has got nothing to do with the Chinese language. It's a completely different family of languages. And it was a very important step. And all those Jesuits, because the Jesuits were so clever, they were the cleverest of all the Christian monastic orders. They knew that they could use Manchu as a kind of back door into Chinese culture. And they did all. The first translation of Sun Tzu Bingfa, for example, was entirely based on the Manchu. And it's a very good translation. So in the 18th century, we're now jumping to Europe in the 18th century, there was a great craze for chinoiserie. Chinoiserie is a kind of term used for taking pleasure in things Chinese. And in the 18th century, it was a very popular to make, you know, these kinds of designs which are sort of vaguely fake Chinese, you know. And here's a wonderful building in Germany. They built a kind of Chinese pagoda, you know, a pavilion. I've never been there. I really want to go. You see, it's a kind of, it's not really Chinese, but it's chinoiserie, you see. It's pretend Chinese, you know. It's just Chinese, what I would call Chinese for fun, you know. Which is very important because unfortunately sometimes the Chinese themselves, and I know I'm speaking to a completely Chinese audience, so you'll have to forgive me, but they sometimes take themselves much too seriously, you know. whether it's in the old days under Confucius or in the present day under the great leader or whatever his name is. I mean, they don't just have fun, you know. And I believe that it's important to have fun in life. Otherwise, what's the point, you know? And in the 18th century, they were very much into having fun, you know. It was a fun-loving century. And they thought Chinese stuff was really good fun, you know. And so they had a lot of fun with it, and they called it chinoiserie. And probably the very earliest English translations of Chinese poetry were in a book by a man called Bishop Percy. Is his name there somewhere? No. Anyway, it's just a little thing at the end of the book called Fragments of Chinese Poetry, and he just takes all of his stuff from the Jesuits. So he's not an original translator at all. And these are my favorite people. And this is an 18th century club called the Dilettante Society. Nowadays, if you use the word dilettante, you're being rather rude. Oh, he's just a dilettante. He just does things for fun. You know, he's not serious. You know, I'm probably called a dilettante myself because I like having fun. And the point is, in the 18th century, these people got together and they created a club called the Dilettante Society. And this is painted. This is a painting of the club meeting, and painted by a very famous 18th century painter called Joshua Reynolds. And these guys, the famous writer Samuel Johnson once said, the only qualification for joining the Dilettante Society was to be able to drink a lot of wine, you know, because they like to drink a lot, and they like to travel in Europe and have a lot of fun, and then come back and have a lot more fun, remembering about their travels in Europe, and then share their memories with other people over some good wine. And I think that's a very good thing, a very excellent idea. And here's one of the famous members of the society. You can see he's got a very large glass of wine which is filled to the top. And he was a well-known, a rake. A rake is someone who, you know, has no morals at all. But I'm not saying you shouldn't have morals, but I think you should have fun. And I don't think. Oh, there we are. Look, if you look at the top of this picture, I put. This was their motto. This was their kind of motto. Seria ludo, which is Latin for I play ludo with serious things, seria. So I take serious things and have fun with them. And that's pretty much the motto of my life, you know. I think you've got to have fun with serious things, otherwise it's so boring, you know, and people just go to sleep, you know. And he was obviously having a lot of fun. And then, at the same time as these people in England were having a lot of fun, in Italy and Portugal and Spain, the Catholic Church was very, very seriously developing a missionary enterprise all over the world. And the most prominent missionaries in terms of Asia were the Jesuits. And this is a very early picture of the Jesuits, who are sort of, you know, bringing the word of God to China. And here are two very famous early Jesuits, the Italian Matteo Ricci, Limato, and one of his great Chinese disciples, Xu Guangqi. And they are, again, pictured here, communicating the word of God to China. And other early Jesuits were very interested in China. There was a man called Athanasius Kircher, who was an extraordinary man. I can't go into him, otherwise we'll never get anywhere, but he was a fascinating man, and he was obsessed with China. And he wrote some beautiful books in which he thought there was a link between China and Egypt, you know. A lot of these early Jesuits were completely mad. They thought that, you know, China had been somehow had received the word of God about 3,000 years ago through a man called Enoch. And anyway, I mean, we don't need to go into that, but they were completely mad. And then the founders of the Jesuit order, this is Saint Ignatius Loyola. He was the founder. And this painting is by the great Rubens. And he was painting these early leaders of the Jesuit order. That was Ignatius Loyola, and this is St. Francis Xavier, who actually went to Japan and died on an island off Macau. And he's always held up as the great Jesuit saint of Asia. And that's another picture of him. And this is the great Jesuit church in Rome. I've been there. It's very, very impressive. The Jesuits are a very, very powerful order of the Catholic Church. And the present Pope, Pope Francisco, he's a Jesuit. He's an Argentinian Jesuit. And the Jesuits are they're known for being very great scholars, intellectuals. And a lot of other people don't like the Jesuits at all because they're so clever. Not always in a good way. And here's one of the earliest translations of Confucius into Latin by the Jesuits. And then various other books. This is a famous anthology of Jesuit writings about China. And this is a very early Jesuit who made maps of China. And this is the most beautiful frontispiece of his Atlas of China. You see here it says, let's see if I can use, Novus Atlas Sinensis a Martino Martinio, which is a new Atlas of China by Martino Martini. It's not a cocktail, by the way. It's just, his name just happens to be Martini, And his first name was Martino. I can't understand how you could be called Martino Martini. It sounds like a comic act, My name's Martino Martini. Oh, yeah? It's like if I was to call myself Johnny or Johnny John or something. But he was obviously a very serious man, not a comic. And this is just an early map of China in the 18th century. China became quite well known in the 18th century and greatly admired all over Europe. Greatly admired. A lot of European developments were actually inspired by what they thought was happening in China, because they thought China was a society run by philosophers, I don't think I'd call the Qianlong Emperor a philosopher, I'm afraid, but they had this idea that China was a perfect society, And here we got might as well have a few Chinese emperors while we're here, have some fun with serious things. There's Kangxi, you see. Never forget he was a Manchu, and he took learning Chinese very, very seriously. He was one of the people who really encouraged translation of Chinese stuff into Manchu. And he was a very great emperor. This is the next emperor who is not my favorite emperor because he persecuted the family of Cao Xueqin, So I don't like Yongzheng at all. And look, he's dressed up in Western clothes. My goodness. I like his cravat. But what about this wig, Anyway, I'll make a confession to you. I went to his mausoleum. I think it's in the Qing Xiling, I think, outside Shijiazhuang, where he's buried. And this is in 1980 when I was first in China. We all went to visit the tombs. And there was it was quite neglected. And there was a broken wall. And I took a brick from the wall and I put it in my pocket. Sorry, I'm confessing. May I be forgiven for my sins. And I took this brick all the way to my home in France, and I put it in a special place. And every time I walk past, I spit on it. That's my vengeance on Yongzheng for having been so unkind to the family of Cao Xueqin. However, as a friend of mine said, John, you shouldn't do that, because if Yongzheng had not treated the Cao family badly, nobody would have written Hong La Meng, So next time I'll kiss the brick. I'll say, thank you, Yongzheng, for being so horrible. Anyway, that's Yongzheng, sorry. And this, of course, is Qianlong. Qianlong wrote 30,000 poems, and there's not a single good one amongst them. But, you can see he really liked to dress up. The one thing about being a Chinese emperor was you get to wear some fantastic clothes, Not that I'd like to wear that myself. But anyway, and towards the end of the 18th century, the Jesuits were actually, they were disbanded by the Vatican. The Pope closed down the Jesuit order because they were doing some strange stuff. Well, I won't go into that now. They behaved in a way that was considered to be not very Christian. And then later, you see, I'm sort of giving you a kind of history in the sense of relations between the West and China. And later in the 1790s, the Brits sent Lord Macartney, Nowadays they just do Brexit, In those days they were trying to get into China. It was a bit different. And they sent this huge embassy to China, which had absolutely no effect at all, except that it led eventually to the First Opium War, because the British were really determined to trade with China. And this is just a popular painting of the First Opium War. And then as a result of that, all over China, all these so-called treaty ports were opened up. And there were literally, I don't know, 20 or 30 of them, and they were heavily developed by the foreign communities. And of course, so was Hong Kong. Hong Kong plays a very important part in this story. And the very first person really to translate the Shi Jing into English was an extraordinary character called Robert Morrison. And there he is with his two Chinese assistants, one obviously younger than the other. And Robert Morrison was an absolute giant of a man. I mean, how he did what he did single-handed, I have no idea. He certainly wasn't having fun, I can tell you that. He was working like an absolute black. He worked and worked and worked. And he was very fortunate. And this is where we have to talk about money, because nobody, translation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Translators have to live, Books have to be printed, it costs money. And, the Jesuits, they were never short of money because, the Catholic Church has always been so wealthy, But, I mean, poor old Robert Morrison, he was just a missionary, living in Macau and Canton, and living in very difficult circumstances. But because of his friends in the East India Company, he was able to produce the most extraordinary dictionary in huge volumes, all paid for by the East India Company. And the East India Company was founded in India. This is the founding of the East India Company in 1600. And later it grew and grew. And this is its headquarters in London in the 18th century. I mean, it was a major multinational corporation, a bit like Amazon, It was huge. It was one of the first global, enterprises. And then they started to get into China. And, they started, as you all know, to do wicked things like sell opium and stuff. And they built, this is the old, what they call the Canton Factories, where all the Western businesses and government offices were confined to a small part of Guangzhou. And that was where Robert Morrison, he traveled between Macau and Canton. He couldn't get into China at all. But what he did do, and that's where he's buried in Macau, his grave is still there and you can visit it. It's in the old Protestant cemetery in Macau. I've been there about 3 or 4 times. It's a wonderful spot. But he did produce this absolutely extraordinary dictionary, which William worked on for many years. And I use a copy of it. I use it all the time because you have to remember that it was the first thing of its kind. There were various sort of manuscripts before it, but this was the first really serious printed dictionary of the Chinese language into English. And it was based entirely on the great Kangxi Zidian, the great dictionary that was commissioned by the Kangxi Emperor. You can follow it literally page by page with the Kangxi dictionary. And it's very, very thorough, and it's very well done. And the quality of the English is extremely good. And this is the dedication page. And you see, he says, to the Honourable Court of Directors of the United East India Company, at whose sole expense the following work is printed. So thanks to the East India Company, those bad people who are doing terrible things and so on and so forth, but no worse than Amazon, no worse at all, or, Exxon or any of these big companies. I mean, they were just one of the earliest capitalist global enterprises. Thanks to them, Robert Morrison was able to create his dictionary, because they paid literally for all the type to be shipped out to Macau. And then they paid for all the printing, the paper, everything. And it was a hard, hard job. And one whole lot of type was stolen, All the italic type was stolen on one occasion. Anyway, he persevered because Morrison was not someone who gave up. He was a real perseverer. And this is a page from his dictionary. It gives you some idea of the beautiful. It's a work that's greatly prized by book lovers, people who study rare books and early printing and stuff like that. You pay a fortune for one of these, the original. I just have a photocopy. And there you have it. There's just a page from it. Now, sorry, I'm going too fast. Yeah. So, and what I didn't realize until a few weeks ago, literally, when I was preparing these lectures, well, actually, Morrison translates a great deal of the Shijing in his dictionary. Every time the Kangxi Zidian, the Kangxi dictionary, says, you know, Shijing, shima, 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 he goes back to the Shijing and gets the whole thing and translates it. And there's actually about 30 or 40 poems from the Shijing incorporated into Morrison's dictionary, which is why, as William has said many times in his research, it's really an encyclopedia. You know, it's not a dictionary in our sense of the word. It's a cultural encyclopedia. You can go through the. Here's one example, you see, and I'm going to talk about it later. But this is what it looks like. It's just incorporated into the dictionary, you see, under a certain word. I can't remember which word it is. And then not only does he translate it, he gives the Chinese, he gives the old Romanization, which is hard to read nowadays because it's not Wei Giles, it's not Pinyin, it's Morrison, you know. And then he gives a translation. He says it's from the Shijing, and then he says what it was. It was composed in reference to Wu Ding, who lived BC 1248. I mean, this is like Wikipedia, you know, 1810, you know. It's all there. And here's another one where he just gives a little translation. He gives this expression, you see, and then he translates it here. Do not plough a large field lest the weeds become abundant. Do not think on a person who's remote and distress your mind. Shijing, you see. And if you go through the whole dictionary and pick out all the bits from the Shijing, there's a lot. I didn't have time to do it all, but I'd already picked out about 30. There's probably about 100 if you really have the time to do it. You could put together a little anthology of Morrison's Shijing. So he really is the first one to go directly to the Chinese and into English. You know, the Jesuits went to the Manchu and put it into Latin, but he went to the Chinese, the hard stuff, you know. He did the hard stuff, and he put it into English. There's another one. We'll look at those later. In passing, we have to mention this man, Sir John Francis Davis. He was the first governor of Hong Kong, or one of the first, and he really learned Chinese very well. He studied hard, and he wrote a book about Chinese poetry. He also wore very beautiful clothes, you know, as you can see. And he was a gentleman who lived to a very old age. I mean, look at that. He was 95 years old. He left Hong Kong in the late 40s and retired to his country house in England and continued to write books about China. But he didn't do much of the Shijing. I think he translated like 2 poems, so we don't need to bother about him. And there's the title page of his book. And now we come to the really important figure. Excuse me for a moment, I'm going to just have a drink. I did a lot of reading about James Legge for my lecture 2 or 3 years ago, and I remember the one thing that stuck in my mind was he kept a pet crocodile. And he used to wave it around his head. He had a little crocodile. I mean, it must have grown so big he had to get rid of it, but for many years he just kept a pet crocodile and he waved it around his head. Now, anyone who can do that has to be an interesting person, you see. Although he was a missionary, he kept a pet crocodile. I have 3 dogs, but I've never had a crocodile. And but he must have been a very brave man and a rather eccentric man to have a crocodile as a pet. And he also had a very wonderful Chinese collaborator by the name of Wang Ta from Shanghai, who was a very, very clever man, and who worked with James Legge for 12 years. And when James Legge did his translation of the Shijing, which is superb, he had Wang Ta work for a whole year beforehand, preparing commentaries and texts and so on. So really, his collaboration with Wang Ta was an extraordinary example of what I call Hebi, you know, 2 things matching each other. Wang Ta wasn't even a Christian, you know. In fact, he was the very opposite. After he finished working with Legge, he went back to Shanghai and was famous for spending most of his time in the sing-song houses, the gelo, you know. He just enjoyed life, you know, and he wrote lots of Liao Zhai type stories and became a journalist. And he was a very, very interesting man. But without Wang Ta, James Legge could never have done what he did. I don't think Robert Morrison ever had someone like Wang Tai, you see, never. But James Legge was able to do that because he lived in Hong Kong. Because by the time James Legge started, Hong Kong already existed. And Hong Kong was a very important place for translation. It still is. And I don't know why James Legge isn't more greatly honored in Hong Kong. Because he's a Hong Kong person. And there should be a Hong Kong, place that honors his name, the James Legge Institute of Translation Studies, or the Hang Seng University James Legge Center for Translation. See, I'm throwing out these ideas, you see, because he was a great man, a really great man with a wonderful sense of humor and a dedication to his job of translating the Chinese classics, one of which was the Shi Jing. Now, to come back to my point, we all need to live, we have to be supported, and we have to have financial backers. Now, Robert Morrison managed to do his dictionary because of the East India Company, but later on, James Legge was able to do his work on the Chinese classics thanks to Mr. Jardine, the first person who set up, the great firm, the Great Hong of Jardines, and which still exists today, And this was the Honourable Joseph Jardine, by whose munificent assistance it is now published, and but for which it might never have been published. This work is inscribed. So he dedicated his Chinese classics, his translation of the Chinese classics, to Jardine. So maybe when you set up the James Legge Institute of Translation Studies, you can get Jardines to give you $1,000 million, okay? Because in memory of the founder of Jardines. Good idea, Gilbert, isn't it? Yeah. I'm always having bad good ideas, right? Now, we'll come back to James Legge later because he's so important. And later on, I think after the break, I'm going to be looking at case studies of 3 poems. But I need to finish the story. And we need to go back to the Jesuits, because after the Jesuits were disbanded in the 18th century, they came back in the 19th century, and there was a new group of Jesuits in China, most of whom were French. And this is one of them. Amazing face. He's like something out of a horror movie, isn't he? You can imagine Vincent Price playing this guy, He's probably committed several murders in his life, And this is another one, Monsieur Couvreur. These are all Jesuit sinologists, but also translators. And Couvreur translated the Shi Jing into French and Latin. We'll come back to him later. And he also did a dictionary. And there's his dictionary. I have a copy of his dictionary. And there's a page, it's a very bad photo, sorry, a page from his dictionary. And there's the title page of Couvreur's translation of the Shi Jing. Now, just to go back to my first point about how translations kind of grow over time, we're going to get in the end to Ezra Pound, the Madman. And one of the things that Ezra Pound had in his library was Couvreur's translation of the Shi Jing. He also had James Legge. He also had the Jesuit. Oh, there's my picture of 3XR. Good, thank you. He also had the Jesuit translation. So it doesn't just come out of nothing, It doesn't come out of nothing. It grows steadily over the compost of years. If you do gardening, you have to put compost. And this is all part of the compost. And then later on in the 19th century, there were other translators. We'll come back to them. I happen to have a copy of this very beautiful book. And I'm going to be talking about him later. Mr. Allen, he was a British consul. He wasn't a missionary, and he wasn't a businessman. He was a part of the, he was like a Wai Jiao. He was a British consul in China. And there were quite a group of those. And they lived in, places like Shanghai and Tianjin and, all these places. And he wrote a very nice translation, actually my favorite translation of the Shi Jing. We'll come to it later. And this painting we'll come back to because he translates one of the poems in a very interesting way. And he makes a reference to this famous painting of a nude lady in the forest. And this is the title page of his book. And we'll just have a look at some of these pictures, then we'll have a break. And this is the world he lived in, you see, the world of the British consul in Beihai, Bakhoi, which is just across the water from Hainan, I think, in southern Guangdong, right? And this is their kind of life. And he would have been one of these, what they call student interpreters. They trained them, again, a good point to be made, that they really put money into training these people. People like Herbert Giles and Allen, they had to work really hard for 2 or 3 years, if not more, of training as student interpreters. Not just a few classes in term 1 or term 2, but like 3 years constantly at the job, and it was hard work. They had a lot of fun too. They always went off riding and shooting and fishing and so. But I mean, they did work very, very hard. And some of them had a lot of fun dressing up in Chinese clothes. You see, that's probably what I would have done. You see, I would have been one of these guys. You see, look at this man. I mean, what a disgrace. But he was serial ludo. He was having fun. And then we get to Ezra Pound. I think that's the point to stop for a short break. So please go outside and have some refreshments, and we'll come back and try and get to the end of this story. Picture of Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound, in a sense, is the final point of the story. And we'll get to him later, but I'll finish the kind of historical overview, and then we'll look at 3 poems in detail. This is a painting of him by his friend, the great Wyndham Lewis, who was a famous painter. And it's just before the Second World War. And very briefly, the tragedy of Ezra Pound is that he was very fond of Italy. He lived in Italy for a large part of his life, and he became a great follower of the fascist leader Mussolini. And he believed in fascism, and he was very anti-Semitic, anti-Jews. And he made all sorts of broadcasts during the Second World War, anti-American and pro the Axis powers, Germany and Italy. So after the war, the Americans, when they took Italy, they arrested him and they put him in one of these pens in the open air. And he sat in one of these pens for months and months in the blazing heat. And it was a real torture. And eventually they took him back to America. And they tried him for treason. And as a traitor, he could have been put to death, but he was let off. There was a lot of support from people like T.S. Eliot and so on, and he was put in a mental hospital outside Washington, D.C. He stayed there for about 12 years, and one of the first things he did, and I'm not joking, was to translate the Shi Jing in a mental hospital, right? We have to remember that when we look at his translation, it was written by somebody who was who was living with really mad people, and people wandering around, doing strange things, I mean, and Ezra wasn't actually that mad, not on the outside. He was mad inside, and he wrote his Shi Jing in a mental hospital. And one of his great friends and collaborators was a Korean by the name of Achilles Fang, who taught at Harvard. And this is Achilles Fang. And these are actually pages from Ezra Pound's great work, The Cantos, one of the longest poems in 20th century literature, and it's a completely mad poem. But he was obsessed with the Chinese language, and he kept putting in bits of Chinese. And he was obsessed with Confucius. He thought Confucius was the greatest man ever. And he was always putting in Chinese characters. He didn't know a great deal of Chinese, but he got to know a little bit more as the years went by. And I'll be talking about this in my lecture next week. He translated, he worked on some Tang poets. And this is the cover of his Shi Jing, one of the many editions. This is the Faber edition. And he always wanted it to be published with this text, side by side, with this sealed text, this Zhuan Shu. But the publisher didn't have the money, And this is an important picture, because you see, Ezra Pound, although he thought he was the best thing since Cadbury's chocolate, I mean, he actually relied on all the old guys. And this is a page from his copy of James Legge, covered with his notes. You see, so he was very dependent on James Legge, and also on the Latin of the Jesuits, and so on. He was, without James Legge and the others, he could never have done anything. Now, although we're not talking about French translations, we really can't leave out the amazing history of French sinology, Because, you know, when I started studying Chinese in 1966, that's a very long time ago, to get into the Chinese department at Oxford University, you had to know French. Why? You think, why know French? Well, I mean, because they believed that all the best scholarship about China was written in French. And today I think they were right. I still think they were right. And these are some of the great French sinologists. And the one who really revolutionized the understanding of the Shi Jing was a man called Marcel Granet, who was partly a sinologist, partly a sociologist. And he had studied village rituals in Vietnam, which was a French colony in those days. And he started to read the Shi Jing. And he just thought, my goodness, these are like simple folk songs from, you know, early days. And they're like people singing across the river or whatever. And he revolutionized the way of looking at the Shi Jing. And it wasn't based on Chinese scholarship. It was based on his own Western training as a sociologist. And this is another very great French sinologist called André Dormant. He translated Hong Lou Meng, actually, nothing to do with the Shi Jing. I just like the clothes he's wearing. He had a beautiful studio in Peking, in Beijing. And he was an amazing man. Anyway, a great French sinologist. And later in life, when he returned from China, he lived in this amazing abbey in France. He was a French aristocrat. And this was the teacher of Granet, Edouard Chavannes, one of the great French. He translated not Shi Jing, but the Shi Ji of Sima Qian. It's still probably the best translation of Sima Qian into French. And it's all online, so I have a copy on my computer. And he was a very great scholar. And this is one of the truly great French sinologists, Henri Maspero, who wrote some of the best studies of Chinese history, especially of Taoism. And because he was Jewish, he was arrested in the war, and he died in Buchenwald concentration camp. So he's one of the great martyrs of the history of sinology. And he was another student of Chavannes. And of course, the great Paul Pelliot was one of the greatest of all the French sinologists of the 20th century. And here's another French scholar. He didn't know Chinese, but he wrote the great study of French, of sinology, called Bibliotheca Sinica. And this was the last in the line, in a sense, of the great French sinologist, Paul Demierville. And he was a student of Pelliot. The French have a wonderful tradition of Chinese studies, which is still going today. Probably the best in the world. I mean, if somebody was to come to me and say, where should I go and pursue my interest in Chinese studies, I would say, learn French and go to France. Forget about the rest of the world. It's finished. Forget about America, forget about England, it's all finished, you know. Go to France. They're the only places, actually, the only country in the West that still values traditional Chinese studies. And this was a personal friend of mine, a wonderful, wonderful French sinologist called André Levy, who lived in Bordeaux. And he died about 2 years ago, very sadly. A superb scholar and translator. He translated Xiu Ji, he translated Jinping Mei, he translated the whole of Liao Zhai, he translated the Lunyu, he translated so much stuff, Mengzi, and he had a beautiful French style, and his Chinese was superb. He grew up in Tianjin. His father owned the French jeweler's shop in Tianjin, in the French concession. They were a Jewish family, and when the Japanese took Tianjin, they had to leave and go to France. And then, of course, the Germans took France, and his father was taken away to a concentration camp, and he had to go into hiding. He joined the resistance movement in France. And then later he came out of hiding and became one of France's leading sinologists, a very wonderful man. Now, this is the Granet study of the Shi Jing that was so influential. And you see, it was published in 1919. And he says it's called Fêtes et chansons anciennes de la Chine, which means ancient festivals and songs of China. Because he believed, and it's based entirely on the Shi Jing, he believed that the Shi Jing reflects the primitive rituals and dances and courtship, love songs and so on of China when it was at a very simple state. And of course he's right. Nowadays all the scholars in China agree with him. And Wen Yidou, for example, basically followed this line of thinking. And Granet was very important. And then we come to the group of late English translators. Robert Paine was a famous American-born writer, journalist. He interviewed Mao Zedong in Yan'an, for example, but he spent quite a lot of time in Kunming teaching at Xinan Lianda, and he brought together a group of students, and I'll be talking about him in my fourth lecture because he specialized in modern stuff, but some of his students helped him translate old poems as well. And then this is a very great Swedish sinologist called Bernhard Karger. He translated the whole of the Shi Jing, literally, word for word. It's of no interest whatsoever as a translation, but it's very useful. Now, I'm going to look at 3 examples in some detail now, so you'll have to be patient because it's about details. And I've taken three poems or bits of poems, and I'm looking at different translations to show you what an incredibly slow and difficult journey this has been. And then I shall end up by saying it's time we had another new one. And it's going to have to be such and such and such and such. I may never get to the end of this because I've got so much stuff to look at, so I'll have to go quite fast. I might maybe step down or maybe not. Let's see. So this is Morrison, okay? It's Robert Morrison. It's from his dictionary, and it's just a translation of these few lines from the last part of the Shi Jing. You know, the Shi Jing is divided into 4 parts. There's the Guofeng, what they call the Guofeng, and then there's the Xiaoya, the Daya, and then there's the Song, the hymns. Now this one comes from the Shang Song, the hymns of the Shang dynasty, and it's a kind of historical hymn, really. And you see, Morrison includes it in his dictionary, and then later on James Legge translates it as well. And this is his literal prose translation, and he writes a note. He writes an explanatory note, and then later on, Legge wrote he put his translation into verse. He tried to make it rhyme. Now the trouble is, you're either a poet or you're not. I'm not a poet. That's why I've never translated classical poetry. I've tried, but I find it very, very hard because I'm not naturally a poet. I like writing fiction. I like translating fiction and philosophy. I may possibly get a bit better at doing poetry, but so far I'm not showing too many signs. My dogs don't really approve of my translation of poetry. They don't enjoy it very much. But Legge had no feeling for poetry at all. So when he put his translations into verse, when heaven's high glance this lower world surveys, attention to the people first it pays. Aware of this our king impartial was, nor punished so as justice to pass. 'Gainst idleness he took precautions sure, so o'er the states his rule did firm endure, and all his life he made his happiness secure. Poor man, he's really having a hard time. He wants to, you see, he obviously wants to get his rhymes, surveys, pays, was, pass, sure, endure, secure. But there's no poetic rhythm. There's no poetic feeling in this at all. It's just hard work, you know. He's not having any fun at all. And unfortunately, that's the case with almost all of his verse translations. And this is Karl Graham. This is the Swedish guy I showed you the picture of. Very serious. No fun in Karl Graham. You wouldn't want to spend an evening with Bernhard Karger, I can tell you. And this is just a very literal translation. But what he does is he's interested in historical phonology, the sounds. So he gives you the old pronunciations of words, you know, that what is nowadays pronounced jian, he reckons in those days it was pronounced clam, and yen was nyam, and so on and so forth. That's all Karl Graham's really interested. He's interested in the history of phonology, of ancient Chinese phonetics. But it's quite useful to have his word-for-word translation. And Later on we have Arthur Waley, and he produced his translation in 1937. In 1933, Arthur Waley, who's one of my real heroes, he was a really poetic person. He said he'd going to translate the I Ching, but he never did. Instead, he turned to the Shi Jing. And he was very influenced by Marcel Granet, whose book appeared in 1919. So he makes his poems from the Shi Jing come alive, but he's also... Arthur Waley was a very sort of upper-class Bloomsbury. He was a part of the Bloomsbury world, which was a very refined London and Cambridge-based group of literary people like Virginia Woolf and Edith Sitwell and so on. And he was rather high class, and he wouldn't have got his hands dirty, you know. And his translation of the Shi Jing is a little bit too sort of, you know, proper, a little bit too prim. He didn't let himself go. He didn't believe in letting himself go. And I remember when he was asked by his publisher to translate Hong Lo Meng, you know, Arthur Waley. He just finished translating a huge Japanese novel, you know, The Tale of Genji, you know. And he said, no, I don't want to do another big novel, I'm too tired. And David Hawkes, my teacher and collaborator, who was a friend of Arthur Waley, said, it's very lucky that Arthur Waley never translated Hong Lo Meng, because he was too proper. Hong Lo Meng is full of naughty stuff, you know, it's full of fun, you know. And Waley wouldn't really have got into the fun of Hong Lo Meng, you know. He wouldn't have enjoyed it, whereas Hawkes really loved it, you know, and so did I. But you see, his translation, at heaven's bidding, they, in brackets, the ancestors, looked down. The peoples below were awed. There were no disorders, no excesses. They dared not be idle or pause. Heaven's charge was upon the lands below. Firmly were their blessings planted in it. I mean, it's frankly quite boring. I mean, I don't like saying bad things about Arthur Waley because he was very wonderful, but his Shi Jing is just not very exciting, you know. Now, this is Ezra Pound. And it's not one of his best, but it's not one of his craziest either. But sky-ordered descent and inspection. Attend to the folk below, without usurpations, without extravagance, nor venture to loll back in leisure. He commanded the lower states and the feudal states by seal. There was happiness. I mean, it's typical Pound. It's not the best Pound, but for example, the way he literally translates Tianming as sky-ordered. I mean, that's eccentric, you know. But he turns sky into a kind of person, you see. That's Sky, you see. He's calling him Mr. Sky, which is just Ezra Pound, you know. But we'll see more of Ezra Pound later. This is the second one. This is a more interesting poem. It's from the Qin Feng, you know, a section in the Guo Feng from the state of Qin, you see. And it's a lovely poem. And this is Morrison in his dictionary, you see. While the autumnal reeds were yet green, ere the hoarfrost was dried, the man of whom I speak was on the rushy bank of the stream. Up the stream I sought him, but the path was rough and inaccessible. After him down the stream I wandered. He appeared there on a shallow, in the midst of the water, still beyond my reach. I mean, it's quite pleasant because Morrison wrote very good English, better English than Legge, but it's not poetry. It's not supposed to be poetry. It's an entry in a dictionary, you see. And Legge, this is Legge's prose translation, you see. The reeds and rushes are deeply green, and the white dew is turned into hoarfrost. The man of... This is a love poem. Let's not forget it's a love poem, you know. It's like Bob Dylan or something, you know. The man of whom I think is somewhere about the water. I go up the stream in quest of him, but the way is difficult and long. I go down the stream in quest of him. Ah, and lo, he's right in the midst of the water. You can't imagine singing it to the guitar, can you, really? And then... and this is the second verse, yes. And then he turns it into what he thinks is poetry. Reed and rush are dark and green, as hoarfrost the white dew is seen. He did make a big effort to rhyme, you see. Him, the man I have in mind, by this water I should find. Please. Searching up the stream I haste on a long and toilsome quest. Downwards then I turn and see, in the midstream standeth he. He is there, but far removed. Vain has all my searching. I mean, bless his heart, he was not a poet, you know. He tried very hard, probably too hard. Reed and rush, luxuriant rise, still undried the white dew lies. Him, the man I have in mind, on the stream's edge I should find. Upwards first my course I keep, though the way is rough and steep. Downwards then, and what to see, in the midstream standeth he. On the islet, far removed, vain has all my searching proved. It's kind of actually quite painful, you know. It's just not a natural piece of verse. And we won't bother. Now, this is an interesting man called Allen. Charles, Francis Romilly Allen. He was a British consul, so he wasn't a missionary, right? He was a man of the world, and he lived in all different ports. I think he was in Fuzhou and Beihai and other places. And he produced the whole book of the Shi Jing. And this is what he does with this poem. The rushes and reeds on the riverside are touched by the frost to a deeper hue, and silver rime in the morning tide is seen in the place of the diamond. Now, straight away, you can see he's got rhythm, you know? He's got rhythm. You can feel the pulse, you know? The rushes and reeds on the riverside are touched by the frost to a deeper hue, and silver rime in the morning tide is seen in the place of the diamond dew. It's got a kind of rippling rhythm, you see? They tell me the maiden of whom I dream, of whom I'm thinking by day and night, will be found on the bank of this rapid stream. I'll go to find her, my heart's delight. It's a very free translation, but I think it works. Why does it work? Because it has rhythm, because it sings. The way upstream is so hard to tread, so steep, so long, that my feet move slow. I'm forced to return, and to try instead the path which follows the water's flow. She's there on that islet, ah, cruel fate, for the swollen wintry waves divide the shore where I stand from the little eight, that's an old word for island, and I may not cross to my darling's side. It's very, very free and rather quaint, but I think it works. And he writes a note. To make the speaker in this ballad differ in sex from the person spoken of is my own idea. He makes it a love song between a man and a woman, you see. The poem may possibly apply to a friend seeking for his comrade, but I think the language is too warm, you see, for that. So he's a brave enough man to say he thinks it's a love song. Good for him. And Ezra Pound, poor man in a mental hospital, you know, he gives the poem a title, he calls it Phantom. You know, you can call it anything you like, but I mean, he calls it Phantom. Dark, dark we read and rush. The white dew turns to frost. What manner of man is this? Lost? Ginna rinop, ginna go down, upstream heavy, there he'd be in mid-water distantly. Chill, chill be the reeds, the white dew not yet dry. I mean, Ezra can't help but write good poetry. That's the trouble. He's got it, it's in his blood, you know. He's crazy, but he's got a kind of poetic impulse. He's got ling, you know. He's got ling. And you can feel it in the words. The words have a kind of bounce, you know. They're like torque. I mean, Allen's words have a kind of rippling effect. These are like dong, 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 you see. Chill be the reeds, the white dew not yet dry. What manner of man is he under the hanging bank? Upstream heavily, gonna swim down on tufted island distantly. I mean, it's only very loosely connected to the Chinese, but it's a rather lovely poem. Ever falls dew on bright reeds. What manner of thing is he who seems to be there on the marge? So he's playing on this idea, he calls it phantom, because he's playing on the idea of who is this person that I love, you see? Upstream to the west at large, hard to go to swim, though he seemed there on the isle midstream. It's not one of his best translations, but it gives you an idea. And Waley is rather typical, rather sort of coy, rather well-behaved, you know. Close grey the rush leaves, there white dew not yet dry. He whom I love is at the water's side. Upstream I sought him, but the way was difficult and steep. Downstream I sought him, and away in mid-water, there on a ledge, that's he. So it's rather cute. It's rather cute, but it's rather sort of too well-behaved, you know. And of those, I would say Allen is the best, you know. It's got real rhythm, and it gets you going, you know. It gets you going. It starts to be a song. Now, the third and last example is is the one which is quite famous about a fox, you see, 有户. It's quite interesting, actually. And Legg's translation is quite sort of prosaic, you know, there is a fox, and so on and so forth. I'm going to have to rush because I'm not going to get through this otherwise. And his note, Legg says, a woman expresses her desire for a husband. There is considerable difficulty in explaining satisfactorily these few lines. I mean, nobody really knows what it means. The language has to be strained to reconcile it with the commentator's satirical explanation, because a lot of the commentators on the Shujing twist the songs into the most ridiculous political allegory, you know. It's just a love song, you know. And this is his poem. I won't read his poetry because it's really quite painful. Now, there was a very interesting man, another consul figure called E.H. Parker, who published translations under the pseudonym VWX. And for years I didn't know who he was until a few weeks ago. But now I realize who he is. And this is most bizarre. They were published in 1879, but they're very modern, you know. I like VWX. I like this man. I like a lonely fox on the riverbank. I view with pity his naked shank. Like a lonely fox, he across does splash. I notice with pity he has no sash. Like a lonely fox, on the bank he goes. I see with pity he has no clothes. I mean, it's the most peculiar song. It's about somebody, we don't know, it's a fox, right? Now, today we'd imagine, we think a fox is bound to be a woman because it's supposed to be a Hu Li Jing or something, but I mean, not necessarily, right? But whatever this fox is, the person looking at the fox notices that bit by bit that the fox has no clothes on, you know. Now, kind of interesting song, really. And this is quite an interesting version. And it rhymes. I mean, he gets the rhyme, you know, bank, shank, splash, sash, goes, clothes. I rather like it. And his commentary is, a vagabond female wishes to console herself with a vagabond man, whose tattered nether garments rouse matronly instincts within her. It's so sweet. I mean, he can't help being a Victorian. And he says that this woman, who's a vagabond, so she's a bit of a kind of gypsy, you know, she sees this other woman, this other guy across the river, and she calls him a fox, right? And she notices that his clothes are a bit, you know, ragged, and he's not got any underwear on, and so on. And actually, I think that's probably supposed to be quite sexy, but he has to say it rouses her matronly instincts. She starts feeling motherly. Oh dear, I should get you some new clothes. Iron your shirts, you know. Come on! It's not about that. It's pretty obvious what it's about to me. And then I've got some blank. This is Mr. Allen. Now, Mr. Allen, who, as you've gathered by now, is my favorite. Completely ignored. Nobody's heard of him. But he's absolutely marvelous. Now, he has no question about what this is about. And he makes a comparison with the woman Musidora. He takes an English reference and calls the poem a Chinese Musidora. Now, if we go back, sorry, I have to zoom back. Musidora, to understand Musidora, you've got to look at this painting, which I did show you, but it was in the wrong place. Sorry. This is giddy, making you feel giddy. But it's quite nice to... Oh, there she is. That is Musidora, right? And the whole Musidora is an 18th century poem in which a man sees a naked lady and feels at the same time guilty and excited at the same time. And there's been many, many paintings of Musidora. And it goes back to an 18th century poet called James Thomson. And when Allen... Sorry, I'm going to go quickly now. When Allen calls his translation a Chinese Musidora, he's using a kind of shorthand for his readers to say it's about someone who sees a naked lady on the other side of the river and gets kind of all excited about it. Which in Victorian days, that was a very brave thing to say, you know. And you see, in James Thomson's poem, a young man accidentally sees a young woman, Musidora, bathing naked, and is torn between his desire to look and his knowledge that he ought to look away, you know. He's using his poetic imagination. I grieve because my heart's delight has vanished from her lover's sight. He's completely given up on the fox. Have you noticed? There's no fox here. You know, you'd give him 10 out of 100 for an exam in translation because he's left out the main lines. Yo-hu, me-yo-hu, you know, there's no fox at all, right? So I grieve because my heart's delight has vanished from her lover's sight. She seeks the rippling ford to lave. Lave is an old word meaning to wash. To lave her beauties in the cooling wave, where crouching as a fox might hide. Finally he brings in the fox, you see. She scarcely dares to lay aside her robes, lest some too curious eye, intrusive, might her beauties spy. First she lets fall her flowing gown, then gently slides her girdle down, until at length she stands revealed, her loveliness all unconcealed. So she's completely naked. But I mean, it's an outrageous translation, but it's absolutely wonderful because he makes it work. He gets you all excited. I mean, come on, let's be honest. It's a really titillating little poem, you know. None of the others make it work, but he makes it work. And it's a poem about someone who spots a lady taking her clothes off on the other side of the river. Very naughty. But I think he's right myself. And he says, none of the commentators take my view of this little poem. The accepted theory is that a woman is the speaker and that it's about a man who gradually loses his clothes. He does not simply take them off. Well, I mean, for me that doesn't make any sense. I think at least his translation makes sense. And it works as a poem. It's unforgettable, actually. Now, Ezra Pound, absolutely classic. He has a title for this. He just calls it striptease, right? Striptease. And we all know what a striptease. I won't do a striptease, it'll embarrass you, but I mean, a striptease is when somebody takes all their clothes off, you know. So he just calls it striptease. Cheedam prowls fox, a heart's to hurt, and someone there's got no skirt. By the Chee deep on the prowl, got no belt on, bless my soul. Tangle fox by Chee bank tall, who says, got no clothes at all. Well, I think he's trying, but he fails. And I think Alan, who's writing very old-fashioned stuff, I mean, Pound is trying to be modern, crazy. And I mean, it's fun, but it's not, it doesn't work. And okay, I think I'm more or less, I'm ending now. You'll be pleased to hear. And my question is, what now? I've looked at all these translations, and basically, I'm trying to say that none of them really work. None of them capture the spirit of the original. None of them has that Ling quality, you know. They don't cry out. They don't sing, you know. And what would I recommend if a publisher said, John, we want to get a new translation of the Shi Jing. What should we do? Well, first of all, I wouldn't do it myself because I'm aware of my own limitations. But if I was to say, okay, Gilbert's going to do a new translation of the Shi Jing. He's got 5 years, okay, funding from the Jardines or whoever it is, right? So he can live in comfort on, you know, an island in Greece or somewhere. And well, what should he do? Okay, first of all, you see, I would say he needs to study the real stuff in English, you know. Not Gilbert, because he knows it already, but somebody else, is it? And I would go to this wonderful book called The Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes, which you may not have heard of, but a husband and wife called Iona and Peter Opie spent their whole lives studying children's rhymes and children's singing games, and they're wonderful people. And they produced several books. I've got this book myself. And this is them, you see, the troupe. And they used to go playing with children in the playground and ask them to sing the songs, and they'd write them down. So that they spent their whole lives, about 50 years, doing this together. They only died about 10 years ago. And if you read some of their, you see, here's one of the rhymes in their book. A master I have, and I am his man, galloping dreary dun. And he'll get a wife as fast as he can with a haily, gaily, gamba, raily, giggling, niggling, galloping, galloway, draggle, tail, dreary dun. I mean, that's the kind of thing, you know. That's what the Shi Jing was. It was an extraordinarily primitive, series of songs with rhyme. They all had rhymes. They're all rhyming, and they've got a real beat, you know. And that's wonderful stuff, you see. And here's another one. This is very famous, you see. Monday's child is fair of face. Tuesday's child is full of grace. We all had to learn this when we were kids. And if you were born on a Monday, you know, you'd be pretty. And if you were born on a Tuesday, you'd be, you know, very graceful. Wednesday's child is full of woe. Thursday's child has far to go. Friday's child is loving and giving. Saturday's child works hard for his living. And the child that is born on the Sabbath day is bonny and blithe and good and gay. You see? I mean, it's wonderful stuff. Just because it's a nursery rhyme doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. You know? We're always having to read translation theory. For goodness sake, read a few nursery rhymes, you know? Have a bit of fun. Drink some wine. Just anything. Just don't read translation theory, you know, because it'll kill you. It's like a poison, you know? Just read a few of these. Here's another one. Some pluck up the fennel seed and some pull up the tansio. A bonny boy to pull up my boots and to gang to bed to nanny-o. Some takes delights in cards and dice, and others some in dancing-o. But I take delight in a bonny lass, and her name is called Nanny-o. You know, wonderful stuff. Now, there was an amazing Italian called Baron Vitale, Baron Guido Amedeo Vitale. He was an Italian aristocrat, and he grew up in Naples, studied Chinese, went to China, and worked as the interpreter for the Italian legation in Beijing for many years. He married a lovely Chinese lady. They had 4 children, and he did a wonderful book called Pekingese Rhymes. He collected children's rhymes in China, and he translated them into English because nobody would read Italian. And he was much admired by Hu Shi and Zhou Zuoyan, who were very interested in children's literature. And then Baron Vitale retired from the Italian embassy and went back to Italy, to Naples, where he became the professor of Chinese with his Chinese wife and his 4 children. And tragically, a year later, he was in a back street of Naples, and he got caught in a fight between 2 people, and he was between them, and the guy shot him dead. He didn't even know him. He was just killed. And that was the end of Baron Guido Vitale. Sorry, it's a bit of a sad story, but there we are. Now, another man called Isaac Taylor Headland, who was a missionary, he was professor of science at Beida. But his real hobby was collecting children's rhymes. And he produced a book called Chinese Mother Goose Rhymes. Nobody knows about these books now. I've known about it for years. And it was printed in, you see, Guangxu Ershilian, so very late on, just before the end of the Manchu dynasty. And you see, here's one of the rhymes. It's a beautiful book with pictures. He did the pictures himself, you see. And this is, my little baby, little boy blue, is as sweet as sugar and cinnamon too. Isn't this precious darling of ours sweeter than dates and cinnamon flowers? Great job, you know. He really did. This is real Ling stuff, you know. I think you should have a seal made that says Ling. And when a good translation comes up, you just go Ling, you know. And it gets like at least 90%, you know, Ling. And that's what I would do anyway. Grandpa feeds baby, you see. Grandpa holds the baby. He's sitting on his knee, eating mutton dumplings with vinegar and tea. Then Grandma says to baby, when you've had enough, you'll be a saucy baby and treat your grandpa rough. You know, it's easy, it's natural, it's got flow, it's got rhyme, it's got rhythm. It's Ling, you know. Mama's boy, you see. Bie pa, do not fear, we'll put the pants on Mama's dear. Do not cry, we'll put the coat on Mama's boy. I mean, you know, if you've had small children, you try to dress them, you have to sing them to keep them happy. I don't want my clothes on. Come on, baby. No, bie, I'll put your clothes on. I just can't. You know, that's how this type of song, you know, as in the Guofeng, you know, has survived in children's nursery rhymes. And we don't read them anymore because they're not translation theory, you see. My nephew is a naughty boy. He comes here every day. He eats until he's very full and then he runs away. It's fantastic stuff, you know. A red pepper flower, ling, 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 mama will listen and baby will sing. If you steal a needle or steal a thread, a pimple will grow upon your head. If you steal a dog or steal a cat, a pimple will grow beneath your hat. This is what we should be giving to translation students, you see, instead of, Lawrence Venuti or Mona Baker or these people. They're wicked. They're monsters. We should shoot them all, Invite them to a conference, Gilbert, and I'll come and shoot them for you. Okay. And then we'll hand out nursery rhymes, okay? Mother, when I marry, what will you bring? A little work basket full of everything. Brother, when I marry, what will come from you? A fancy cloth towel. Think that will do. Oh dear, what's happened there? Something's all turned off. Okay. My happiness, sister, you will not mar. I'll give a broken bottle and a little smashed jar and send you, you nuisance, away, very far. I think we've almost got to the end, actually. My goodness. How's the time, William? I lost my watch, you see, on my way, on my travels. I had to give myself 100 for good timing, okay? So in conclusion, what are the qualities of a good translation that we need to look for in this new Shijing that Jardines are going to finance, and someone's going to have 5 years on a Greek island drinking Greek wine, and actually I don't like Greek wine, but Italian wine, and produce a translation which is creative, which is, and I've used this expression, 合璧, that's when the two sides match, when it's a good match. And that's what you also call 文学阴阳, when it has the affinity. And when, of course, it's got this quality of ling, which is when the dancers are below and the rain's falling from above. And, if you dance below, and if you open to the rain coming from above, then here, these three sanko, the words will just come out, because they will be inspired. They will be ling, and that will be the right and absolute rhythm. And we look at the history of the Shijing translations. There have been little moments, little glimpses of light, but nothing really successful. And we need something new, something that will open up a new world. When people read it, they will feel like Keats's poem. They'll feel like they see a new planet, They'll suddenly feel in touch with those early Chinese girls and boys, out by the river saying, I love you, come across the river now. Oh God, I saw him on the riverbank, he didn't have any clothes on. Whoa, what's the matter with me? Why am I so obsessed with this person, that's what it's all about. It's simple song, love songs, and all kinds of things like that. And it's time somebody did a translation like that. And then the world will have a view into this new world of ancient China. Thank you very much.
My question is that what do you think of prose poems, especially prose poems like Rabindranath Tagore's Shapers? You mean his Nobel Literature Prize laureate, and his poems have been recognized by the world, and it seems to you that rhythm and rhyme are the two most upmost elements in poem.
Sorry, whose poems are they? I didn't.
The most important elements in poems are rhythms and
who
rhymes.
Who said that? You did.
No, it seems according to your talk, concluded.
That's old-fashioned poetry, you see. Mm-hmm. I'm very old-fashioned. I think that one of the main themes of my talks this year mm-hmm. is to attack modernism, Mm-hmm. I'm anti-modernist, I'm postmodern and anti-modern, I think that the modernist movement did terrible harm. I think the May the 4th movement did terrible harm in China as well. I think we should bring back the Baogu Wenjiang. Everyone should have to write classical Chinese essays. Mm-hmm. I'm the most counter-revolutionary, 最反革命, and so yes, I think a good poem should sing. It doesn't necessarily have to rhyme or have rhythm, but almost inevitably has to have rhythm, because rhythm is what gets you going. Mm-hmm. Rhythm is the pulse of life. So much modern so-called poetry is just dead. It has no rhythm. Now, if you have trouble rhyming, I'm not going to force you to rhyme, mm-hmm. but some people have a natural gift for rhyme. Mm-hmm. It just comes out of them. There's a wonderful writer, an Indian English writer called Vikram Seth. He wrote a whole novel called The Golden Gate in rhyming verse. Mm-hmm. He just about 400 pages, and Lord Byron wrote a novel in verse too, rhyming, called Don Juan. And some people find it very easy to rhyme, you know. Some people find it easy to play tennis, you know. Other people make good, you know, Hong Sha Ro, you know, it depends. People have different gifts, you know. And some people find rhyme, I'm not going to force people to do rhyme, but I think that we've lost a huge amount of the real essence of poetry, you know, in the last 100 years. And people like Ezra Pound, I'm afraid, are largely responsible for that, you know. And T.S. Eliot and so on. So this is not politically correct on my part, but I long since have ceased to care about being politically correct, I'm afraid. But I think you mentioned some poet laureate. Who was that?
Yeah, I mean Rabindranath Tagore, you know, the Indian poet. And
I'm sorry, I've never heard of the person. I'm terribly
ignorant. in Chinese, Tagore. Tagore.
Oh, Tagore!
Yes.
Rabindranath Tagore,
yeah.
Wonderful guy, yes.
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 But his poems doesn't rhyme. And,
no, I know.
And has no rhythms. And what's your appraisal?
His prose poetry, I mean, I've read a lot of his stuff. It has a rhythm. It does have a rhythm. It's not a kind of meter. There's a difference between rhythm and meter. Meter is tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. It's like iambic or trochaic or spondaic. That's a fixed meter, right? Tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti, or ti-tum-ti-tum, or tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. That's a meter. Rhythm is just a natural flow of language, you know. Now, Tagore's English is very flowing, you know. It has a rhythm, but it's a natural rhythm. And he creates an amazing atmosphere in his stuff. I mean, Indian English, you know, it's wonderful stuff. Of course, W.B. Yeats was a great admirer of Tagore. And yes, he won the Nobel Prize. Mind you, winning the Nobel Prize doesn't mean you're good. I mean, it's a kind of, you know, not everybody who's won the Nobel Prize is necessarily brilliant. And a lot of people who didn't win the Nobel Prize are very good. So, but I think I would draw the distinction between rhythm and meter, you know. If you can do meter, that's fine, you know. But of course, the other thing is that, and I'll be talking about this in my second lecture, which is that the modernists give the Westerners the impression that Chinese poetry isn't like old-fashioned verse. Actually, Chinese poetry is terribly old-fashioned. Meter, it's got incredibly strict rules on meter, whether it's lu shi or ci pai, you know, and rhyme and tonal rules. It's incredibly bound by rules, you know. And to suddenly say, I'm going to just translate it like modern prose is ridiculous. It's very false. I think it's very false. It gives a very false impression of Chinese poetry. But I'll be talking about that next week more. Because I think that when you translate, you know, Tang poetry, or even earlier, Tao Yuanming, for example, if you translate it into modernist kind of free verse, you're really misleading your readership, you know. Because it was actually very old-fashioned. Writing poetry in China was quite different from writing poetry in the West. You didn't wait until you suddenly saw daffodils and then you were inspired and you wrote a thing about daffodils. People wrote poetry every day. It's like you write a blog, you know, today. I mean, you just do it. And after all, from a certain moment in the Tang Dynasty, you had to do it for your exams, you know. It was a daily occupation. And Qianlong Emperor wrote 30,000 poems, you know. God save us, you know, but I mean, he did. So I think we have to be more respectful of the nature of old-fashioned Chinese verse, you know. But I'll be talking about that next week. More so than, yeah.
I'll be looking forward to that.
Okay, thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
Should we stand up?
If I sit down, yeah.
Should I? Yeah, I wanted to ask, if you're trying to translate a poem that you know belongs to a very different era, right?
So I'm a bit hard of hearing.
If you want to translate a poem that comes from a very different era, like the Shi Jing, what are the things that a translator would have to prepare? For example, is it enough to just have mastery of the Chinese classical language, or should there be very conscious effort to know the social-cultural context? What are the things that matter a lot?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I mean, if I was going to do this job, and I have been asked to do it, and I said I won't, because I'm too old to take on a big job like this, would take me at least 5 years to start off with, just to master the traditional commentaries and the explanations of many, many generations. They're not all bad, the commentators. Some of them really go into detail about old customs and stuff. You need to do all the hard work. You can't just fly in like in a helicopter, you know. But then you have to, having done all that hard work, I mean, it's a bit like when I worked on the I Ching, you know, I spent 12 years on that book. An awful lot of it was just hard work. And then you've got to let go. Then you've got to be able to let go of all that and take off. And that's when you have to start, like I suggest at the end, reading nursery rhymes, reading songs, until you can feel confident that you can sing, you know. I mean, I gave a class once in Melbourne to a group of graduate students, and I was talking about this subject, and I said, until you can sing, if you're going to translate the Shi Jing, until you can sing your translation, you might as well give up, you know. And I took a translation and I started to sing it. And actually it was one of Ezra Pound's translations. It came out really well. And, you know, that's the second stage, when you have to let go and try to create. But you have to do the hard work first. It's a combination of the two, you know. And you've got to have lots and lots of time, and otherwise you might as well not do it, you know. The trouble nowadays is that people, they don't have the time, you know. They want to have an app, you know, that says you can just do it on, you know. And it doesn't work, you know. So it's a combination. I don't know if that answers your question, but sort of, yeah. There's a lot of good work being done on the Shi Jing, especially in Taiwan, actually. Some very good work. And it's fascinating. And then once you've done that work, then you start to go into a different mode, and you start to imagine yourself into that space, and then you let the song come out, you know. Like in Ling, you know, you do the hard work, and then you can let go, and the words will come down from on top, you know, and will take over. Oh, yes. You'll have to speak up because I'm very hard of hearing. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, Professor Minford. For students learning English poetry, especially for second language speakers, do you have any good poets for us to start with?
Oh, my goodness. That's very hard, because all I can tell you are who my favorite poets are, right? And I think my favorites, you'll never go wrong, because they're the big ones. I mean, I would start off with Keats, you know, because Keats had that natural genius for writing English that sounded like music. I mean, unbelievable. You just read any of his famous poems, like, you know, Ode to a Nightingale, or Ode to Autumn, or Ode on a Grecian Urn, and the lines just flow like water, you know. He was a great believer in water, you know. He wanted it written on his grave, you know, that he lived like water, you know. The words just turned into water in his mind, you know. Keats is my absolute number one. And then I have to say, I would very strongly urge somebody to read the poetry of Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is much more famous as a novelist, but I much prefer his poetry. And I'll be talking about him in my third lecture, because I think if you're translating Ci poetry, the best model is Thomas Hardy. He does these long, short lines, and it's very like Ci poetry. But then, of course, you've got the more modern people like W.B. Yeats, you know. Yeats, again, was a natural poet. And Dylan Thomas was a drunk, you know, but I mean, he was a Welsh drunk, but my goodness, he had a gift for language. But there's so many good poets. I mean, I've come back to the old Victorians like Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson was a wonderful poet. But I must say Keats remains my absolute top favorite. You can't go wrong with Keats. You just can't go wrong. But I also there's a very unpopular nowadays poet called John Masefield, who was writing in like 1910, 1920s, very old-fashioned, I suppose you'd call him Edwardian poet, John Masefield. I like his poetry very much, but that says more about me than about him. I'm very old-fashioned. I like a good poem that rhymes and, you know, has rhythm, and that you don't have to struggle. I mean, look at T.S. Eliot's The Bloody Wasteland. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Why would you ever give that to anyone to read? It's just, and Ezra Pound rewrote most of it anyway. And I find T.S. Eliot unbearable, you know. But then you'll hear about that next week. I'll have a good go at T.S. Eliot. Because he said that Ezra Pound invented Chinese poetry for our time. What a ridiculous thing to say. How could Ezra Pound invent Chinese poetry? It's been around for like 2,000 to 3,000 years, you know. But T.S. Eliot was such a pretentious idiot, you know, and the worst of the modernists, you know, and an unbearable person, yeah. Don't read T.S. Eliot. No, don't read T.S. Eliot. There's a very good book about poetry that's not at all academic by a man called Stephen Fry, who's a very famous actor. He played Oscar Wilde in the film Wilde. It's a book called The Ode Less Travelled, which is a bit of a joke on the road less travelled. The Ode, O-D-E, Less Travelled. I think it's one of the best books about poetry. And he's very much like me, very old-fashioned, you know. Teaches you how poetry works, you know. So it's terribly good. I think for second language learners, there's nothing better than learning poetry, you know, because it goes deep into the structure of the language, you know. And, you know, that's why these language textbooks are so awful. When I learned Chinese, we had to learn all about, you know, those, what were their names, those young people from Eastern Europe who lived in Beijing called Gulanka, Gubo and Palanka. They always 买吃票, you know, 我到火车站去买吃票. I mean, why not give people a poem, you know? It's so boring, you know. I mean, how much for 1 kilo of cloth, you know? I mean, if you really want to make people give up learning a language, don't just give them that kind of stuff, you know. I think you should give them poetry right from the very beginning. Not too much. You don't want to make it hard, but make them love the language, you know. That's what saved me. My teachers gave me wonderful things, you know. My teachers, when I was an undergraduate, they gave me Hong Le Mong. They gave me, you know, Dao De Jing. They gave me stuff like that. And that's why I've enjoyed studying Chinese for the last, you know, 53 years, because I was given good stuff. Nourishing, you know. Fun. Stuff that's actually got a bit of, you know, a bit of taste, a bit of flavor. Instead of this boring, I mean, you know, it's the stuff that's approved by the Confucius Institute. You know it's bad, you know. Sorry, but that's... You can see I'm a man full of prejudices. Terrible, terrible prejudices. But I think, you know, keep away from the Confucius Institute, keep away from translation theory, and just enjoy life. You know, that would be my advice to whoever's trying to study Chinese, because the Chinese poets really knew how to enjoy life. I mean, read Li Bo, you know, my goodness, what a genius, you know. And anyone translating Li Bo should read Keats, you know, because they were, you know, they were both intoxicated with language, you know. I think I've said enough. Oh, Professor Zhu, my former student.
Very simple. What's the meaning of chinoiserie? You were about to
Oh, chinoiserie. What does it mean?
Yeah.
Well, of course, the word chinois simply means Chinese, right? And when you put chinoiserie, that just means 东西, you know, Chinese things, right? Chinoiserie. And so it's like a kind of term that was coined in the 18th...
It's a noun. It's an adjective or a noun.
It's a noun. It's a noun, yeah. It's a noun. I'm trying to think of other nouns that end in E-R-I-E. Well, like embroidery, you know, or embroidery, or there are lots of words that I've run out of ideas now, but it's a noun to describe the fashion in the 18th century for things Chinese, you know, Chinese clothes, Chinese porcelain objects, Chinese buildings, you know, Chinese wallpaper. And it was a very big fashion, it lasted for a long time. And literature was only a very small part of it. They didn't really want anything too serious, you know. And they were just into... they would build little pagodas, you know. If you go to London, you go to Kew Gardens, which is the Royal Botanical Gardens. There's a very famous pagoda there that was built in the 18th century. That was one of the famous chinoiserie buildings. I invented a term recently because a friend of mine called Jeremy Balme and we created a website called China Heritage. And he believes in what he calls new sinology, which is very serious. I believe in what I call new chinoiserie, right? Which is like not serious. It's doing stuff to do with Chinese which is fun and which is maybe quite light-hearted. Things like Liao Zhai Zhi Yi, you know. For me, that's what I call new chinoiserie. So I'm trying to bring back chinoiserie, which is very reactionary of me.
Have you completed that project on the internet? You and Jeremy Barney, that website.
That website's going, yeah.
We can visit that website now.
Oh, yeah.
Really?
You just type in ChinaHeritage.net.
Okay.
And every week, Jeremy puts more stuff. He's translating a very wonderful professor from Tsinghua called Xu Jiangrun. Have you heard of Xu Jiangrun? He's a professor of law at Tsinghua, and he's writing very, very outspoken essays criticizing Xi Jinping, you know. And Jeremy's translating it all.
Can you repeat the name of the website?
It's called ChinaHeritage.net or .org. But if you just type in China Heritage, you'll get it. And we created what's called the Wairarapa Academy for New Sinology, right? It's a very serious term, but we had a symposium last year in New Zealand, and Leo Lee came, and a few other people came, and from Hong Kong actually, some people came from Hong Kong. Okay, I think it's time to stop now because we've been at it for rather a long time. Thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed it. Thank you.